All right, welcome to week 19, everyone. This week we are going to be talking about Paranoia and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, both by Shirley Jackson. You're so close to the end, my friends. Please remember that June 1st is the last day that I can accept any late work from your class, from my 12th graders. June 1st. If it comes in after June 1st, it will not count towards your grade. So you really need to aim to have anything to me on June 1st. I always encourage you to watch the weekly overview videos. I think it is helpful to have a voice and a face to guide you through the week. All right, Paranoia and the Sorcerer's Apprentice. There are no supernatural elements to either one of these stories. The Sorcerer's Apprentice refers simply to the musical piece that is played in the story, but there's nothing supernatural here, just some people who may or may not have some things to worry about. The stories are posted, of course, in the Week 19 folder. They are also in the library folder, so they are in two different places. I'll bet if you Google searched for them, you would find them as well, but you can find them in two different places in Schoology. You have two assignments due this week. Let's look at those. You have a response writing. You guys are the experts on this by now. You know they need to be at least one page, but they, of course, can be longer. You know they need to be neatly edited and proofread. You know they need an MLA header and MLA page format, and you know you need to support your assertions with quotes and examples and include an MLA in-text citation for any evidence. All right, you have some options of prompts here. Option number one goes with paranoia. At what point does Halloran Beresfield's experiences start to justify his paranoia? How much of this is in his head and how much is legitimate paranoia? As you read the story, really ask yourself, how much should he actually be worrying about? How much is he creating? How much is he reading into? You can go any number of directions with this. Option two is also about paranoia. Paranoia leaves the reading wondering if Mr. Halloran Beresfield was really being followed, if he has reason to be paranoid, or if he is creating the danger in his own mind. Is his wife really in on the conspiracy, or is he imagining the door locking? Could her last lines, "Listen, he came here after all, I've got him," could they be harmless or evidence of a bigger danger? This is your creative writing option. So write the next bit of the story picking up from the end. What happens next? I will put no limitations on your imagination here. Just keep the story going for a little bit longer. What do you think happens next? I'm talking about immediately after paranoia ends. All right, option three goes to the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Analyze Krishna's behavior. That's the little girl. Just like we discussed with Charles or the witch, is Krishna's behavior deviant? Is it dangerous? Or is she just being a kid, albeit a somewhat unpleasant kid? Argue your case and use specific examples to support your assertion. Option four also goes to the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Analyze Miss Matt's behavior and her reaction to Krishna. Is her general state of anxiety and depression affecting the way she reacts to Krishna? Is Krishna's behavior an exaggeration in her eyes because of this, or is her reaction to this little girl totally appropriate? Sometimes when we're really stressed out or depressed, or we're just really keyed up about something, it's pretty easy to kind of maybe overreact to things. So is that what Miss Matt is doing, or is she reacting totally appropriately? All right, just pay attention to the rubric as you do this assignment, and don't skip out on that MLA header. A lot of you are doing that, and it's costing you some easy points. You have a discussion to go along with this week on Paranoia or the Sorcerer's Apprentice. In this discussion, tell me a little bit about what story stood out to you, which you liked best. Choose a quote from the story, post it here. Why did you choose that quote? And what do you think the theme is of your chosen story? The theme being the big message, and why? Remember to respond, react, and relate to at least one other post. All right, let's talk about Paranoia by Shirley Jackson. Mr. Beresford walked along swiftly, humming musically to himself. So Mr. Halloran Beresford leaving work on a day that seems like any other day. But is it? What Mr. Beresford saw was a thin face under the light hat, a small mustache, a coat collar turned up. Funny looking guy, Mr. Beresford thought, lightly touching his clean shaven lip. Perhaps the man thought Mr. Beresford's almost unconscious gesture was offensive. At any rate, he frowned and looked Mr. Beresford up and down before he turned away. Ugly customer, Mr. Beresford thought. So he starts to see this guy wearing a light colored hat, and he starts to see him all over the place. The last thing Mr. Beresford saw as the bus went down the street was the man in the light hat grinning at him from inside the door. So the bus door slams shut right before Mr. Beresford gets on. And then who does he see on the bus as it pulls away? That guy in the light hat. The funny-looking guy in the light hat. Mr. Beresford turned clean around in the walking line of people and watched the man in the light hat turn abruptly and start walking downtown, about 10 feet in back of Mr. Beresford. What do you know about that? Mr. Beresford marveled to himself and began to walk a little too quickly. So this guy starts showing up everywhere. He just saw him on the bus, but then as Mr. Beresford keeps walking down the street, here the guy is again, like he got off the bus for the purpose of following him. But he's still thinking, like, well, what do you make of that? That's a crazy coincidence. The man in the light hat came into the shop, and Mr. Beresford turned his back and busied himself picking up one thing after another from the counter. So Mr. Beresford is getting increasingly paranoid, as per the title here, and he goes ducks into a shop. He's like, I'm going to duck into this tourist shop, and I'm going to pretend like I'm shopping. This guy's going to walk by me, and I'll forget it all. The problem is, though, the man in the light hat comes into the shop after him. Dun, dun, dun. What does it mean? The people passing in either direction looked smaller and smaller. Mr. Beresford realized that he was being forced to step backward as the two men advanced on him. Easy does it, the man in the light hat said to the clerk, and they continued to move forward slowly. Oh my gosh, and now they're cornering him in the shop. It's the clerk and this guy in the light hat coming towards him, and he's freaking out now. This man seems to be chasing him. Mr. Beresford can't get away, and then he gets cornered. And then he jumps on a bus. He's like, I'm going to get away. I'm going to jump on this bus. Getting off, Mr. Beresford said. Can't stop in the middle of the block, the driver said, not turning his head. It's okay with me, the driver said. Next stop. You just passed one, Mr. Beresford said. Well, okay, so he gets on the bus, but the driver won't stop for him. He says, stop here. And the driver's like, I can't stop between stops. Oh, and then he goes right by a stop, and the driver's like, man, there was there. So is this a conspiracy? Is the bus driver in on this thing too? Now Mr. Beresford's really freaking out. Just you wait, he said to the man in the light hat and started for the policeman. Halfway to the policeman, he began to wonder again. What did he have to report? A bus that would not stop when directed to? A clerk in a souvenir shop who cornered customers? A mysterious man in a light hat? And why? Mr. Beresford realized suddenly there was nothing he could tell the policeman. He looked over his shoulder and saw the man in the light hat watching him, and then Mr. Beresford bolted down a subway entrance. He had a nickel in his hand by the time he reached the bottom of the steps, and he went right through the turnstile. So he sees the man in the white hat again, the light hat, I should say, as he gets off the bus, and he's I'm going to report you. I'm going to tell the police about you. But then he has the really very real big realization here that what am I going to report, right? Nothing's actually happened. So is it all in his head? A few people laughed. Most of them were watching. Mr. Beresford's odd behavior is starting to attract attention, and people are starting to laugh at him. He finally gets home. He makes it through the door. He's like, oh, thank goodness I'm safe now. You're terribly late, darling, his wife said affectionately. And then what's the matter? And it seems like this is it. He's safe now. He's good. He put his head against the soft chair as she went out. Never knew that door had a key, his mind registered dimly as he heard it turn. Then he was on his feet with his head against the door, listening to her at the telephone in the hall. She dialed and waited. Then, listen, she said. Listen, he came here after all. I've got him. So he makes it home. Whether this is real or not, is he safe now? Or is he not safe? Is his wife in on it? Is she not in on it? Is this, he came here after all, I've got him? Does that simply mean, like, it depends on how you hear it and how you say it, right? So think about the different connotations this could have. Is this guy really being followed? Is he in the middle of a conspiracy theory? Or has he got himself so keyed up about this thing in his head that everything looks suspicious? All right, let's talk about The Sorcerer's Apprentice, by another story by Shirley Jackson. Miss Matt was at least partially conscious that she looked like the teacher everyone has had in English for first year high school. So poor Mrs. Matt. She's like a first year teacher, and you should be nice to your first year teachers, kids. It's a hard job. But she comes home and she cries herself, through the afternoon, and this is like her routine. She comes home and cries for a while and then tries to like build up the nerve to come home, go out for another day. She doesn't really want to be a teacher. She talks about how she really just was kind of hoping she'd find a husband and get married and skip out on this, but it hasn't happened for her yet. With her meekest expectations still unsatisfied, Miss Matt lived very quietly alone in an inexpensive two-room apartment, with a tiny kitchenette and a Cézanne print over the sofa. She knew her landlady fairly well. They had a cup of tea together occasionally. So she's living in this tiny apartment on the cheap. She had very meager expectations, and even those have not been met. On a Wednesday afternoon, freed early from high school, Miss Matt came home and straightened her apartment and washed her hair, then her head wrapped in a towel, wearing a Chinese silk housecoat. Miss Matt sat down with a peaceful cup of tea and played Afternoon of a Faun and the Sorcerer's Apprentice on her small portable phonograph. Sometimes, when it had been a hard day at school in the future and looked unusually dark, Miss Matt would permit herself to cry luxuriously for half an hour. Oh, man. So yeah, she's doing her like comfort routine. And if any of you have anxiety or just hate, have had times in your life where you've hated where you're at, you understand this. I certainly understand this. You have a routine that you do and you're like, okay, I'm going to be okay if this works. So this is what she's doing. She's home on a Wednesday afternoon, just trying to take it some time. Miss Matt was crying on the afternoon Krishna came to see her. There was a sudden, vigorous knock on the door. All of a sudden, this strange little girl just shows up on her doorstep. She doesn't know her neighbors. She only knows her landlady. The child opened the door wider and slipped through, closing it behind her. She was carrying a large album of phonograph records, which she deposited carefully on Miss Matt's maple end table. Are those your records? Miss Matt asked hesitantly. Marion said I could come and ask you if it is all right for me to play them here on your phonograph, the child said. What's that? She said. What's that? She pointed at the Cézanne. So this kid just lets herself in. She just barges in. She has this box of records with her, and Miss Matt's like, hi, having some me time here. Who are you, anyway? Krishna Raleigh, the child said. I'm 6 years old, and I live downstairs and right underneath here. Both she and Miss Matt looked at the floor, and then Krishna went on. Marion said I could come and play my records here. Who is Marion? Miss Matt asked, and why should she give you permission to come up here? That's my mother, Marion, Krishna said impatiently. At this point, I would probably toss this kid out. I've been like, no. But Miss Matt doesn't. She's actually much nicer than me. So they do put the records on. He played all these records, Krishna said. He plays the piano in concerts, her voice rose defiantly. He's the best piano player who ever lived. These are her father's records. Her father is playing piano in these records, and Miss Matt is, at this point, being polite. She's asking the little girl questions. She's tolerating this. Miss Matt nodded sympathetically. He kills people, Krishna said. He's overkilling Nazis right now. She sighed theatrically. He used to play the piano. When he's killed all the Nazis, he's going to come home and play the piano again. Well, he plays beautifully, Miss Matt said softly. It's all right, Krishna said. Her eyes wandered around the room and came to rest finally. What's that thing? Okay, so this takes what started harmless, if maybe super annoying, takes a turn when Krishna decides she wants Miss Matt's doll, a doll that she has up on her shelf. I want that doll, Krishna said. She slid off the couch and scampered across the room to the doll. Well, that's my doll. Miss Matt forced herself to stand by the phonograph. Your mother wouldn't like you to take someone else's things. She doesn't care, Krishna said. Krishna, Miss Matt said, you may not have that doll. Put it back, please. Krishna turned and looked at Miss Matt in surprise. I want it, she said. I won't let you play your daddy's records on the phonograph, Miss Matt warned. All right. Krishna was pulling interestedly at the doll's head, twisting the red silk dress. I've heard them lots of times. Miss Matt walked over and put her hand firmly on the doll. Give it to me. she demanded, and the kid won't give it back. This is so obnoxious. I can just hear this little girl. She's like, "Man, I don't care. I don't care if you want to play it. I'm going to take this. I want it." She reminds me of that little girl in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the I want it now girl. Yeah. "No," Krishna said, "you're a crazy old woman, crazy, crazy." Deliberately holding the doll out in front of her, she ripped off the silk dress and let it fall to the floor, then snapped off the head. Miss Matt watched Krishna for a minute, her chin trembling. Then this little girl destroys it. She tears it apart right in front of her. What a brat. Miss Matt is so angry she breaks Krishna's record. She takes it off the phonograph and smashes it. You can tell Marion anything you like," Miss Matt said. For the first time in her life, her voice was shrill. "Now you take the rest of these records and get out." She seized Krishna quickly by the shoulders, pinching her as hard as she could, and began to push her towards the door, slapping her hands to make her drop pieces of the doll. Krishna, still laughing, clung stubbornly to the door frame, bracing her feet against Miss Matt's furious shoving. Oh, what a little brat, right? So Miss Matt, though, is also she got so angry she broke the record, but she's also kind of freaking out because what's going to happen now? It's one of those like, I did what? Oh my gosh. So she shoves the kid out the door, locks the door, and then she freaks out. I've got to hurry, Miss Matt thought. She stepped quickly around the broken record on the floor to the broken doll, scooped up the dress and the other pieces, and hesitated, looking around. Finally, she went to the kitchenette and opened up the cupboard under the sink, put the pieces of the doll behind boxes of soap and dusting cloths. I'll tell them that awful child did it, she was thinking. If I hurry, I can say the child did it all. Now she's really like, what has she done? Who's going to come after her? Is her mother, Marion, going to come up? Is her landlady going to come up? Are the police going to show up? What's going to happen? She broke this child's record. She shoved her out of her apartment. She pulled a hat over her still damp hair, tucking the straggling ends up under the hat and holding them there with many hairpins. When she put her coat on, she turned up the collar and ducked her head down so her face would be hidden. Then she picked up her pocketbook and went out, closing the door behind her quietly. Go to the movies where it's dark, she was thinking. When she got down the first flight of stairs and was near the door of her apartment, directly under hers, she hesitated for a moment before she ran down the hall to the next flight of stairs. Come back later, she thought, when they're all tired of looking for me. Okay, so here's a different kind of paranoia in this story. The paranoia that she's going to have to face some kind of crazy repercussion or consequence for what she's done to this little girl's record or how this interaction with this little girl went. It's easy to maybe step back from this story as an outsider and be like, nah, the kid probably had that coming. Like, yeah, you overreacted by breaking the record maybe, but it's going to be pretty hard to get too mad at you here. But Miss Matt's just free. She's spiraling here. She's just spiraling in this story. All right, so different types of paranoia, different types of kind of anxiety-driven behavior. All right, paranoia and suspicious thinking. This is a pretty common thing that ails us all from time to time when you think about this in the psychological world. Doctors would consider this criteria that you see here on the screen if they worried you were suffering from chronic paranoia. I think that, generally from the research I was doing on this, it looks like nobody's going to worry about you too much if you're occasionally paranoid. I think we all are. And sometimes we're right. Sometimes people really are looking at us or thinking about us. Most of the time, not, though. Honestly, most of the time, people aren't thinking about us at all. But chronic paranoia would be when it overwhelms your thoughts and you really cannot get it out of your head, or you feel like it's adversely affecting the way you behave or interact with others. I won't go through all of this here. You can look at this at the PowerPoint in the Week 19 folder, of course. But doctors would consider this criteria if they worried you were suffering from chronic paranoia that might be impinging your life or the quality of your life. So when does it become dangerous, though? When are you indulging a paranoid thought too much, and when is it likely all in your head? Nobody who's having insecurities likes to think that it's all in your head, but sometimes things are up there, and we have really kind of blown them out of proportion. So how do you know? Where do you draw the line? Here's what the experts would say. Here's the criteria that they would say when you're starting to cross the line. No one else shares the suspicious thought. There's no definite evidence. There is evidence against the suspicious thought. It's unlikely you would be singled out. You still have the suspicious thought despite reassurance, and your suspicions are based on feelings and ambiguous events. So when there's empirical evidence that this isn't happening to you, but you still think it, it could be a sign that it's starting to be an issue. Paranoia can be dangerous, and it can be a sign of a more severe mental disorder. It's often an early sign of things like schizophrenia or even bipolar disorder, both of which are reasonably common and have treatments. So, if that is what a person is suffering from, there's a lot of hope, and there's actually a lot of treatment out there for this. When it's untreated, though, it can be deadly. So, symptoms of schizophrenia that your doctor would look for if you are exhibiting chronic paranoia, and I'm talking the kind of paranoia that's taken over your life, lack of motivation, slow movement, changes in sleep patterns, low libido or sex drive, a lack of self care, disorganized thinking, changes in body language and emotions, withdrawing from family, friends, and activities, and hallucinations and delusions. That's kind of where that paranoia might come in. You should seek help if you find yourself experiencing any of the following. Paranoia, you don't have to live like this. And if you're having chronic paranoid thoughts, chronic anxiety, chronic thoughts that are intruding upon your ability to be happy, your ability to function in your life, you don't just have to sit with it. There's a lot of help out there for this. The characters in these stories that we read about, maybe Mr. Beresford is having a one-time paranoid experience, but it sounds like Mrs. Matt in The Sorcerer's Apprentice has lived like this for way too long. She's unhappy, she's depressed, she's anxious, and it looks like her anxiety is kind of getting the better of her. So, people with paranoia may experience feeling anxious, upset, angry, confused, being suspicious, believing someone is persecuting them, fearing that someone is following, chasing, poisoning, or otherwise plotting, feeling as though someone else is controlling their thoughts and actions, feeling as though their thoughts are disappearing or being taken from them, or suicidal thoughts and behavior. There's causes for this. It's a physical illness, just like if you have a cold or the flu or a physical illness. Mental illness is no different, and I'm glad that the stigma around it is lightening somewhat, so people do seek help for this. Risk factors can be anything from genetic, like maybe it runs in your family, medical. I mean, sometimes viruses and illnesses that you've had, poor nutrition, can all contribute to and cause mental illnesses. Biological, it could just be the way you're built. It doesn't have to have been passed down from in your family. It could just be the way your brain's built. Environmental, stress or past trauma. So if you've had a trauma in the past, this can definitely trigger something. All right, so if you're experiencing any of this stuff, just know you don't have to live like Miss Matt, and you don't have to be as paranoid as Mr. Beresford. You can actually get quite a bit of help for this, and there's no reason to live with chronic paranoid thoughts or anxiety that really is as crippling as it is in these stories. All right, this last slide is my Works Cited page if you would like more information on any of these subjects. Thank you all for listening. Put any of your questions or comments up there in the chat and stay with me because we will talk here in our Zoom meeting about these stories and about the content. Thank you all.